Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of First Samuel, chapter 16, and we'll continue in verse 14, actually. But before we begin, I'd like to actually do a little review with regards to the life of David and the family of Jesse. And so we find that in verse 10 here, Jesse here had made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these. And there are one more." And I had mentioned that this young one also means insignificant. Insignificant or unimportant. Now, we have seen that there are 7 sons here, plus 1 son here, and this would be David, who wasn't brought in to meet up with Samuel. And I'm suggesting that this word youngest doesn't necessarily mean youngest, means insignificant, unimportant, or smaller in stature. And in total, Jesse has 8 sons. In total, 8 sons. Now, we begin with this background, and then we will visit a number of passages, and then we will come back to 1 Samuel chapter 16. I would like to draw your attention to 2 Samuel chapter 17, verses 25. In 2 Samuel chapter 17, verse 25, we read of 2 women. And right here, we have Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, the sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. I'd like to draw your attention to Abigail and Zeruiah. We'll get back to this. And these are the sisters of David. And as sisters of David, there is another name here. And the question was, why wasn't their father Jesse? Why is it Nahash? All right, so we have a question here, and we will get to this point. There is a view where Jesse is also Nahash, right? That is one view. The second view is Nahash is another person, right? Another person. Which also tells us that if B is true, then the father of the sisters are from another person, which means that the mother of David could be another woman. And that's the speculation I'm placing with you. I'm just trying to present to you a number of various views before we go on. So remember this point here, that Jesse is the father of all the sons, but we have a name called Nahash right here. And one view is that Nahash is another name of Jesse, or B, Nahash is actually another man. We come back to 1 Chronicles chapter 2. The 1 Chronicles chapter 2 has to do with the sons of Israel, or sons of Jacob. So all 12 sons are discussed here. And so if you take a quick look, that I want to point out to you is actually in verse 15 and 16. But we begin from verse 13. And so you see here, Jesse became the father of Eliab, the firstborn, Avinadav, the second, Shemiah, the third, Nathanael, the fourth, Radai the fifth, Odzem the sixth, and David, right here, is the seventh. But we saw in 1 Samuel 16 that he had 8 sons. 7 passed by Samuel, and David was the 8th. But here in First Chronicles chapter 2, we only record 7. And more interestingly, the sisters were Zoriah and Abigail. And we saw just now that the father of these is Nahash. Again, I point out to you, can it be that Jesse is Nahash or not? Right? Or not. So in the Jewish view, there are two. One is that Jesse is Nahash, and two, Jesse is not Nahash. You can only have two options, right? And each of the option have an implication on the family of Jesse. Now, with this, I want to draw your attention to the lineage chart. We look at version 1 of the lineage chart, and we take the first view that Jesse is also known as Nahash, right? It's also known as Nahash. And so the wife of Jesse is unknown. So we call her unknown wife number 1. And in 1 Samuel 16, verse 10, there were 7 sons. And the 7 sons are these: Eliav, Vinadav, Shammah, Nathanael, Radai, Ozem. And then we find in First Chronicles chapter 27, verse 18, eventually he served in the army of David. And his name is Elihu, or Elijah in other translations. And so these become the 7 sons that pass by the face of Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 10. Now we also read in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 15 that David is number 7. He was king of Israel, and we find this in 2 Samuel chapter 5. Now this is one version. Now in this version, we are unable to explain why David was left out of this particular incident to present themselves to Samuel. That is an issue that we're trying to address. And the fact that if David is actually left out in the cold, why wasn't he brought in if they were all one big happy family? Now, perhaps they may not be one big happy family, and that David has a problem with the rest of the family. Now, I'm sharing with you some views which is not commonly discussed. And for the sake of this study and its completeness, I would like to just point out to you that this is version 1, where Jesse is also known as Nahash, as some Jews would have us believe. We take a look at version 2. Now, version 2 tells us that Jesse has 2 wives. First wife, the first 7 sons. Second wife had a husband with Nahash, who is not Jesse. Now, could he be the Ammonite king of 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1? We will never know. Because one of the things that the Bible likes to use is when people like a name, they reuse those names quite often. Now, if that may be the case, then the second wife is not Jewish, right? It is not an Israelite, could be a Canaanite, could be an Ammonite if that's the case. But we know for sure that Nahash is a father of Zeruiah and Abigail. And these are the sisters of David. And so we see it this way, then we find that perhaps, David would be the son of the second wife. And that can play out with a slightly different twist to the story. If that be the case, then we now know that all these 7 sons and David are likely to be in a tension. Now, if that be the case, then we could very well understand why David was kept to guard the sheep and be in a more dangerous environment. That's the background, right? That's the background. Now we can actually see that if that would be the case, then Psalm chapter 51, verse 5 would point out that David was actually born in a similar situation as he had with Bathsheba or Bathsheba, and and gives us an indication that Jesse and an unknown wife could be the same as David with Bathsheba, right? And basically in the same situation as Jesse with an unknown wife. Uh, if that be the case, then we can now understand that there could be some friction between the two families. And that would be the second view. Now, I would draw your attention right now, as a close to this discussion, to Psalm chapter 69. In Psalm chapter 69, reading from verse 8, and the psalm has a very peculiar slant for David because it doesn't appear to be written at a time where, regarding his time as king. It was written when at a time with regards to before he became king. And so he writes, I have become strangers from my brothers, an alien, a foreigner to my mother's sons. And this is an A and a B, that the relationship between David and his brothers are strangers. The zeal for your house has consumed me. The reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. And it goes on, I wept in my soul with fasting. It became my reproach. When I made sackcloth my clothing, I became a byword to them. Who is them? The brothers. David was faithful to God's house. The brothers are laughing at him and talking bad about him. Verse 12, those who sit in the gate talk about me. I am the song of the drunkards. People would laugh at him. People would sing. So it gives us a very different picture of David before he became king. And he had a terrible time, according to Psalm chapter 69. In verse 20, it says, reproach has broken my heart and I am so sick. I looked for sympathy, but there was none. For comforters, I found none. And so David was a lonely soul in the house of Jesse at this time. Verse 21, they gave me gall for my food, my thirst, they gave me vinegar to drink. And it shows that they have really mistreated him. Made their table before me become a snare. When they are in peace, it becomes a trap. Now, all of these becomes a more enlightened reading if you see that David was really estranged from the brothers. And hence that should give us a feel of how we could read this particular psalm. And now back to 1 Samuel chapter 16. With that as a background, David wasn't well loved at home, if we see it that way. Whether there was another wife or whether it was from the same wife, something really happened that David was not in a happy family or in a happy environment until he was anointed king, probably to the surprise and annoyance to the other brothers who thinks that David was nothing, good for nothing. Now, at this point in time, when David was anointed, Samuel went home in verse 13, and we read in verse 14, now Now, this one we have to do a little bit of retranslation. This would be a spirit, right? A spirit, and this would mean a wind or a character or the presence of the Lord departed from Saul. Now, this word departed is not leaving. In our sense of the word depart, this word actually means turn aside. This would be the general meaning. When you talk about turning aside, if this was Saul, right? If this was Saul, uh, the a spirit of the Lord could mean all these. It can also mean uh, a spirit being, right? A spirit being or an angel. Uh, and I would say that this would be a more metaphorical, that the presence of God would have left Saul in the sense that he doesn't have the comfort, right? The comfort of God had turned aside, turned away, removed, I think would be a good word, was removed from Saul. Because remember, when the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily, he had the character of king, that he felt bold, he had the presence of God, and he had a certain character. But now, as God says, I will not want you to be king, and Samuel leaves Saul, immediately the moment when David was anointed, that same spirit or character or the presence of God and the comfort of God was immediately removed from Saul. And we read that an evil wind from the Lord terrorized him. The English word seems to be very expressive here. So an evil wind, evil here would mean Ra, right? Ra'ah. And this would be something that in the eyes of Saul, it is not good, right? And it came, and this word here, terrorize, uh, could be understood as overwhelm, right? Made him very afraid. So what came? A character of fear, right? A character of fear. And so suddenly Saul came from a character who is very comforted, very calm, very mindful of God. And suddenly that disappeared. And in its place, it is expressed, and this is a Hebrew expression, it is expressed that Saul became very afraid of his own shadow. He is terrified. The fear overwhelmed him. And so verse 15 says, Saul's servants then said to him, look now, an evil spirit from God is terrorizing you. And so there is always this things unknown is generally ascribed to God. When they saw Saul being so scared of his own shadow, the servants then comment that, you know what, an evil being, or it could be an evil spirit or an evil angel of God, an evil spirit being sent from God. And that's how they would speak. When it's good, then there's a good angel. When it's bad, it's a bad angel. But the idea here is they could actually see things change with Saul. It's all very vivid. You see, behold, that they can see that Saul is now no longer the calm, cool, collected king. When he became king, he is now that terrified of his own shadow king. And they are saying that, well, must be from God, right? Must be from God. And so verse 16 says, let our Lord now command your servants who are before you, let them seek a man who is skillful player on the harp. Now, what do you mean by a harp? This word harp really is to play a string instrument, who is skillful on the stringed instrument. And they are of the opinion that music can calm the soul of Saul, because he's now displaying a character that is terrifying. And so that expression, evil spirit from God or evil spirit sent by God, all of this really is a description of what the servants have seen or are looking at Saul, that there is a change in his behavior. And it is said that the character of Saul, the wind of God, or the Spirit of God, or the character of the Lord had been removed from Saul. And so they think music can calm the soul. And so that whenever this evil wind from God is on you, he shall play the musical instrument and you will be well. What do you mean well? This word actually means cause to be good. Now, this is a very interesting expression because this contrasts with evil. Whatever is happening to Saul is disturbing his soul. And with the music played, it would be good for the soul. So it's functional. So it's called good. So this is a contrast of good and evil, where something is disturbing Saul's soul and the music played by this person can calm his nerves. Verse 17. So Saul said to his servant, yes, why don't you do that? So it says, provide for me now a man who can play well and bring him to me. Now, we are missing quite a number of words here. So the word provide is to see for me. Go and look, inspect, go and observe, find. Well, it's not so much as find, look for someone, see on my behalf that you can find a man who can play the harp or the string instrument. The word well here is tov. This is good. Good means as he plays, the fear of Saul can be calmed down. And bring him to me. Ask him to come to me. Verse 18. Then one of the young men said, look. Now it's all about looking, right? It's all about looking. See, look. I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who can play the harp and is a man of mighty valor, vigorous, right? A warrior, and one who understands. Prudent in speech literally means he is wise, right? He is wise in speaking. And then he's a handsome man. He has well, I guess you could say he's a man of appearance. So the English uses handsome man, right? But meaning he's a man that is good to look at, right? And then again, he says, the Lord is with him. And this is crucial. This fact is very important. The Lord is with him. For Saul to know that this man is used by God. And so Saul says, yes, go. Ask him to send your son David, who is with the flock, and he is there with the cattle, right? With the sheep, right? The sheep, the goats, uh, and the small cattle. And so Saul says, good, ask him to come and join me. Now in verse 20, Jesse would be honored that a king has actually called upon him to send specifically David. Now this is very interesting because, as I mentioned to you, the brothers and Jesse are not in good terms. So very quickly, Jesse took a donkey with bread and wine. You notice this is always bread and wine. Bread and wine is a staple, something to eat and something to drink. In the Hebrew culture, uh, there is always something to eat and something to drink because this is Oriental. You know, in our Oriental culture and our lifestyle, you find that eating and drinking is crucial. And so in this journey, eating and drinking is also crucial. Why not a jug of water? Well, this one specifically says wine. And it is to be merry and happy, like a celebration, as you can see. And a young goat. And the young goat could be used for food. And send them to Saul. And this is an offering, or what we call, in the Oriental view, a gift, right? A gift for the king. And it is David, his son. Now, why would this be an interesting feature is that in an Oriental culture, like ourselves, when we go and meet someone very important, we will never go empty-handed, that we will bring an offering. At this point in time, you find that David is probably in his late 20s, maybe 28, right? But haven't arrived at the age 30 yet. But a, 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 a handsome young man. And this idea of verse 20 is really Oriental, to bring something to meet the king. And this something would be something appropriate in their lives. And in those days, it would be something of a celebratory with a goat, with bread, and with wine. We come to our last three verses. And so David came to Saul. Notice, king, this is the people. Who is greater? The people comes to the king doesn't go to the people, right? In this case, you can see Saul is the king. David is just anointed. Now, whether Saul heard of it, I don't think Saul has heard that yet. And so David came and attended him. What do you mean attended him? The word attended him means to take a stand, uh, to take a stand, take a stand or position to his face. Now, this is the literal word. attend attended him means David took a position that is to his face. So it gives us a picture that David is serving, right? Serving Saul. Next, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. So let me just explain this. Saul loved David greatly. Now, the word love here is ahav. And again, I have mentioned to you that love is when it is expressed in terms of concrete expressions. So to love, for Saul to love David would be able to give something to David, to protect David, right? And to provide and give or provide. And so, how did Saul express? So we have an A and a B, that David became someone who lives the implements. It says armor bearer. This actually means the one who lives his weapons. It is not really wearing his armor or carrying his armor, but one who really stands beside him to have all his gear ready for Saul. And that would be Saul's most trusted. Understand this. An armor bearer, the one who lifts the weapons, is one whom Saul trusts that he would not take the sword to kill him. And that is how Saul loved David, in the way where we can actually visualize and see the imagery of those actions called love. It is not this heart palpitation that you feel so gooey about David. This is not that kind of an expression. Saul loved David because of what David could do to serve him to his face, calm Saul down so that Saul can function properly. And in so doing, Saul found David to be one that he can really trust with his own life, and made him an armor bearer in this sense. Verse 22. So Saul sent to Jesse saying, and this is a report. This is a report. Now notice this word sent to Jesse would mean to send a message. When the message is sent to Jesse, Jesse would have to know that it is from Saul. It is a royal decree. So it says, let David now stand before me. So now you can see the same word, right? The same word. In verse 21, it says here, attended him. And now in verse 22, stand before me. These are the same words. It is to take a position to his face to serve Saul. And look at this, for he has found favor in my eyes. Favor means grace. And again, I draw your attention. Grace and favor in the Hebrew context is very clearly that David has done something to Saul, and in that service to Saul has led Saul to be very happy with David. And the expression says that it is Saul loved David greatly, became his armor bearer. So to love is to give, to provide, to protect, and made him the most trusted amongst his servants. And he testified to Jesse, the father, that you should let David basically it is saying, you telling Jesse, you do it. You know, let David now serve me in this form because he has found grace in my eyes. It is not suddenly Saul had favor on David. It is what David has done first. So let's see this, right? David has done something that pleases Saul. And then Saul says that he has found favor, found grace in my eyes. And so grace is a result, or grace or favor is a result of what David had first done. And it pleased Saul. And that is how we would understand grace or favor. And the word is chen. And it's always from the viewpoint of the speaker. The one who says, I am giving grace, I'm giving favor, is the one who has seen what he is pleased with. And he is very pleased with David. And so in verse 23, it reads this as our last verse. So it came about whenever the wind, right? This would be, I would say, not the wind, but a wind. A wind sent from God, that belongs to God, sent from God, came upon Saul. So when Saul suddenly gets frightened. Now you see that this kind of an expression or a kind of a behavior is when somebody has lost confidence in what he stands for. And why did Saul lose confidence? Because God says, I don't want you anymore. And Samuel is no longer around and he is left alone. And suddenly he just discovered that that confidence feeling that he had disappeared, removed, right? We read by God. And in its place, something is disturbing him. And sometimes whenever he thinks of something that scares him, that's called an evil wind, right? An evil wind. Now we find that whenever Saul is disturbed and have this fear that overcomes him, David would take the string instrument, which we call a little harp, and he would play it with his hand, right? Play it with his hand. The result of that music, Saul would be, how should we say, Rava, right? The word is Rava, refreshed and be well. Now, understand this, the word refresh comes from the word ruach, means that his how should we say, his spirit is his spirit or his spirit is smooth. He's able to breathe again. Now that is this idea of this word refresh, which is ravak, right? Ravak comes from the word ruach. It describes his spirit, the wind that is within Saul, that he now can breathe better. So when the evil wind, the evil character is upon Saul, he would be very frightened. And when David plays, he would be able to breathe. He's probably having a psychological attack, right? And then that evil wind would depart from him. The evil wind would turn aside, would be removed from him. So what we are reading in 1 Samuel chapter 16 in these last few verses is describing the visual imagery of what's happening to Saul. We cannot, it doesn't describe what's inside that we cannot see. It is describing what we can see. And by that description, it's the wind that Saul would be troubled. Saul would be disturbed. Saul would be very frightened and terrified with the music played. That sense of being terrified, he calms down and it leaves him, and he would be able to breathe again, and his spirit will be smooth. And that would be the description in verses 23. With this, we come to the end of our session today.